Okay. Well, welcome everybody to the 2020 Senior Thesis presentations. This is our first day presentations, and Ashley Dougherty is our first speaker. Things are a little bit different this year. The seniors have been asked to whittle their theses down to a 10-minute oral presentation. They need to have memorized about 50% of it, including the introduction and the conclusion. And when they have finished their presentation, they will take questions from the judges for about 15 minutes. So we will go ahead and get started. Welcome, Ashley.
Thank you. Imagine a field overflowing with life. The soil is alive, moist, rich, and inhabited by numerous ecosystems. The rows of corn bear ripe, nutritious food. Every predator, pest, and plant is doing its job to sustain the building blocks of life. Now, picture a field dark and lifeless, with soil crumbling and eroded, covered in weeds and dead crops. We know which option we want, but not many know where we, as a nation, are headed. The first scene shows a picturesque farm life, while the second depicts the future reality for American agriculture. Modern farming erodes the soil, stunts the farming ecosystem, and produces unhealthy food. In total, modern farming is leading America down the path of economic destruction and unsustainability, often harming our society in unseen ways. If we do not act soon, agriculture, the foundation of life, will fail to support America. This is a daunting thought, but fortunately, there is a solution. Traditional agriculture balances established practices with modern knowledge and has the characteristics necessary to revitalize our system of agriculture. Thus, America should replace modern agriculture with traditional agriculture as a means of restoring the environment, human health, and the economy. To clarify my arguments, I will define some key terms. Traditional agriculture can be broken down into three parts: organic inputs, biodiversity, and crop rotations. Traditional farms use natural fertilizers and pest preventative methods instead of relying on agrochemicals or unnatural fertilizers. Biodiversity, the quality of raising a variety of crops and animals in one setting, distinguishes traditional farms from modern monocultures, or the mass production of one crop. Finally, traditional farms use crop rotations to replenish the soil. These characteristics build on each other to create one healthy, self-sufficient, and natural farm life. For my first point, traditional agriculture restores the environment that modern agriculture destroys. What is the most basic tool required for agricultural success? PhD Matthias Stoll says, soil is one of the most important natural resources because it is the central basis for all agricultural activity. Soil is the beginning and the end of farming. It is human nature to take some basic resources for granted, but when those resources are tied to basic needs, our ignorance can be costly. If the soil becomes eroded or malnourished, our crops will be fewer in quantity and lesser in quality. This is no longer an issue of dry farmland. America faces an exponential decrease in healthy, productive soil as a result of modern farming. Agrochemical use and monoculture, two of the most damaging modern practices, destroy the soil. Chemical use dries out the soil, while machinery overuse compacts it. Because they create concentrations of heavy metals, agrochemicals also inhibit the natural processes within the soil. Overall, agrochemical residues break down the soil's organic matter in fertile topsoil. Another harmful practice, monoculture leaves the soil unbalanced and unproductive by consuming specific nutrients. For example, crops like soy transfer or fix nitrogen from the air into the soil, while a crop like corn cannot. Crops need nitrogen for growth, so when farmers do not rotate between different crops, they deplete necessary nutrients. In contrast, traditional farms foster a system of life. Plants, livestock, wildlife, all working together, pushing us forward, building our soil, and living in harmony. Soil is the basis of production, yet we are willing to trade it day after day for convenience, harming our long-term ability to produce. Due to its natural characteristics, traditional farming restores the soil. Traditional farms use fertilizers such as manure, compost, and plant residues, which increase the supply of organic matter and nourish the crops and soil. Cover crops, another natural fertilizer, trap moisture into the soil, gather nutrients into their biomass, and bring nutrients up to the surface to be harvested. Traditional farmer John Chester provides a practical example of the natural ecosystem. Chester planted cover crops in his orchard, which replenished the soil and fed his sheep, while the sheep provided additional fertilizer. This is the beauty of the natural ecosystem at work. One living thing helps the next until every biological process is nourished. Over 4 centuries ago, the Native Americans and Pilgrims shared farming techniques that fostered biodiversity and mixed crops. Even then, the natives noticed that certain crops give and receive different nutrients, and they planted accordingly. The biological makeup of traditional farms reflects greater diversity and thus healthier soil. After admiring his transformed farm, Chester says, "The soil was dead, lifeless, and compacted, but as we added cover and life on top, a process billions of years old awakened. Now, on this little farm, there are up to 9 billion microorganisms turning away at decaying life forms. Purpose-driven microorganisms, alchemizing death to life in just one clump of healthy soil." While I disagree with his Earth Age theory, Chester's point still stands. The age-old process of plant growth only reaches its full potential when agriculture harmonizes with the soil. In Genesis 1, God created perfect harmony between nature and man, giving man dominion over all the earth. The fall tainted, but did not destroy, God's established order. We can still witness his perfect natural ecosystem today, and must choose to glorify and protect rather than harm it. This leads to my second point. Traditional agriculture produces nutritious, chemical-free products, while modern agriculture harms human health. Agrochemicals are the villain, the Joker and the Darth Vader, if you will, of agricultural production. They leave chemical residues in food which endangers the health of consumers. In the US, agrochemicals cause approximately 20,000 accidental poisonings annually, with 2,000 cases needing hospitalization and 50 ending in fatality. Compare that to another statistic. The last fatal commercial plane crash in the US was over a decade ago in 2009, also resulting in 50 fatalities. Why then do airplane crashes remain a common fear while agrochemical poisonings go unmentioned? Considering the damage caused by accidental poisoning, imagine the subtle but long-term effects of everyday agrochemical exposure. Whether for or against agrochemicals, all sources conclude that unnatural inputs cause and exacerbate disease. Agrochemicals contaminate the area around them, including water sources, and leave residues that cause neurotoxic diseases, reproductive, and dermatological effects, as well as asthma, allergies, diabetes, and cancer. Health scholar Charles Benbrook says, "This is a public health train wreck that no one has the tools, the ability, or the motivation to turn around. The end game will be very costly." While there is uncertainty surrounding the full effects of agrochemicals, this should be compelling enough to eliminate their use. Traditional farming increases human health due to its natural methods. Because organic farms use natural inputs, people have at least 70 times lower exposure to chemicals when eating organically. Organic food does not expose consumers or workers to chemical application or residues, decreasing the amount of disease. Studies show that organic consumers display a lower risk of maladies such as childhood allergies, obesity, types of cancer, diabetes, and cardiovascular disease. Some might attribute this to their healthier lifestyle. While that is a factor, agrochemicals have shown that they harm consumers' health. We cannot continue to take the risk. Traditional farming not only eliminates the issue, but uses natural inputs to add supplies of organic matter and bolster the crop's nutrients. Traditional farms also provide better living conditions and food for their livestock. Modern farming continues to harm the health of consumers in unknown ways, and it is time to make a lasting change. Imagine a dark and desolate field, suffocated by weeds and filled with crumbling soil. If nothing changes in America's agricultural system, we won't have to imagine. Even if, as many say, modern agriculture outproduced traditional agriculture every single time, the ultimate end of modern farming is deteriorated soil and damaged health, which equals the highest form of unsustainable agriculture. Modern farming is leading America down a slippery slope, but we are not too far gone. Traditional farming balances nature and agriculture in perfect harmony and holds the key to restoring the environment, human health, and the economy. Thank you.
She's so happy. Oh gosh.
Ashley, nice job during that presentation, laying out your arguments. Obviously, limitations prevented you from getting into the refutations that I know you covered in your paper. Talk through some of the strongest refutations and give your response to those refutations.
Of course. So the two refutations and two of the biggest arguments against my claim would be that traditional agriculture cannot produce enough food for the American population, and that implementing traditional agriculture on such a large scale at this point in the game is impractical and not possible. So for that first point of refutation, that traditional agriculture cannot feed the American population, I had a multifaceted response to that. First of all, I looked at some of the common statistics used to support the claim that traditional agriculture produces less than modern agriculture, and I looked at how those did not cover the whole scenario and all the circumstances that those statistics commonly used in support of modern farming did not take into account factors such as the different kind of crops and how much is being produced on a farm of one crop versus multiple crops, and how just in general those statistics are used out of place. I also brought into my refutation the arguments that on a whole, America is not suffering from a lack of food, and we are throwing away food that could feed, I don't remember the exact statistic, but feed millions of families each year. So we are not suffering from a lack of food. And then I also brought in my the ultimate argument that even if traditional farming produces slightly less than modern farming statistically, modern farming is on a downward trend of depleting our soil and destroying our farmland. So ultimately, the ultimate end of modern farming is going to be far less than traditional farming. Whereas traditional farming does support our soil and does build up that environment and has a dependable, self-reliant system of agriculture. And then that second refutation, that it is impractical and cannot be implemented throughout America. I talked about how some of the common arguments are that modern farming is so established into our system today, it is widely used, and it is necessary to produce as much as we do. And then I address those by saying how that using a common analogy I looked at different analogies, but I specifically looked at Cuba and their agricultural system and the change they went through there, and how they switched from one system and I talked about how their economy collapsed because they were too dependent on modern inputs and they were too dependent And then I talked about how they were able to make the transition.
20 miles. I think.
And overall,
Ashley, this is Mrs. Young. I'm going to interrupt you there because you're doing a great job, but we want to keep the answers a little bit shorter. That
okay,
was a big question. You did a wonderful job, but I want to make sure we have time for other questions.
sounds good.
Great job.
So yeah.
Ashley, well presented. Nice work.
Yeah.
Can you clarify something for me?
Of course.
In one of your confirmation points, sort of a sub-point under that, you said that the agrochemical and machinery overuse are two of the most damaging modern practices.
Yes.
And then towards the later on, you emphasized that we ought to eliminate the use of agrochemicals. So can you explain to me how what the difference is between talking about the overuse of agrochemicals and then the emphasis on needing to eliminate agrochemicals? So you say that overuse is the danger, but we should eliminate it completely.
Yes. So I think what I was referencing there, that agrochemical overuse has become a particular problem because our farmland in general across America has reached such a point of just deterioration from those agrochemicals that those agrochemicals are not even addressing the issue and not bolstering the crops and doing as much to help and nourish the crops as people are saying. They are a large portion of those agrochemicals, I don't remember the exact statistic, but a large portion of those agrochemicals are not doing their job and are not helping the crops in any kind of way. So that's what I meant by overuse. We've come to such a point where the soil is so deteriorated that a lot of those agrochemicals are not even functioning or practical in the system today. But overall, my argument with that was just that has become such a problem, but traditional farming eliminates that. We don't need to use those agrochemicals. They aren't even performing their full task today. And they are doing far more harm than they are good. So that was my argument.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm curious, Ashley, you mentioned kind of the ultimate end, if we continue with modern farming, is going to be the complete desolation of soil and an end to any sort of agricultural production at all. Is there any sort of timeline if we continue with modern farming as it's being implemented today, when we would see that kind of destruction and deterioration take place? I mean, how many years are we looking at that we would have if we just continued as we're going today?
Yeah, so many sources that I read supported that argument and that we were on a downward trend, but it was more vague language that it would deteriorate the soil and lead to destruction for future generations, because something like that is very hard to estimate. So I'm sorry, I do not have a timeline for that. It's not something that they're predicting like 1,000 years down the road. It is a lot sooner than that, but I do not have an exact timeline because it is more of a vague issue that we're able to witness throughout the country, but not able to approximate a date because of the many factors involved.
So you don't have like even a range like 200 years, or I mean any kind of rough range like that? You said less than 1,000 years, but
yes. Oh, a rough range from multiple of my sources would be 100 to 150 years.
Okay, great, thank you, and beautiful job presenting. Yeah.
Ashley, question about human resources. You're advocating going back to a more traditional way of farming. So, and you mentioned this in your paper, sort of industrial revolution. How do you remove the technology, and how would you do that? And then how do you find the human resources to pull this off and find workers who can sustain this level of farming?
Yeah. So to answer your first question, getting rid of technology, I'm not completely advocating for not using technology. Of course, what I'm advocating for does require some step back from what we are using today, but I think that requires a deeper analysis of what technologies do we use today and how are they harming our soil and our environment and our health, and what ones are still can still fit within this mold of agriculture, which ones can be used to better benefits. And then as far as, I think my answer for the second question kind of ties into this as well, as far as getting the workers involved, getting somewhat reverting back to a more agrarian lifestyle, not fully, but how would we be able to pull that off? I think that ties into consumer demand. If we as the consumers are more aware of this issue and then demand organic products in return, if we demand this kind of farming because we are concerned for the health and the environment, people will step up to fulfill that. Workers and producers, farmers will step up to fill these roles and help with revitalizing our system of agriculture.
Ashley, you mentioned that agrochemicals cause, I'm trying to, maybe you can remind me of the statistic, but the number of poisonings that occur because of it, leading to
Yes.
up to 50 fatalities annually. And I think the number was something around 20,000. Is that correct?
Accidental poisonings, yes.
Okay. And you use that to determine that this is a high risk, and so we need to get rid of agrochemicals. And you compared that to a plane crash analogy, which was a great comparison. What other things would you compare that to say that it's too much of a risk?
What would I compare the accidental poisonings to?
Right.
I think I use the airplane crashes because that is a common fear, but I think looking at other common fears or maybe not as common, but things that people think about far more often than accidental poisonings, things like lightning or sharks or attacks like those, and things that are often irrational fears that people hold. When you actually look at the statistics and compare that to this issue of poisonings and what agrochemical residues are doing to our health, I think this is a far bigger issue than people tend to realize, and that is really highlighted when compared to those common fears of shark attacks, airplane crashes, anything like that. Is that what you were getting at?
Yeah, good. Can I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
So I just did a quick search, and I think there were 38,000 car-related fatalities in 2019. Given the logic of your argument, should we not drive cars?
Yes, that is a good question. I would say that driving cars, while that is a great argument and very comparable statistic-wise, the two things are very distinct and separate from each other, because both agrochemicals and cars are very ingrained into our society. However, agrochemical use is something that affects a much smaller group of people if we were to change and transition into that, and it is a smaller, it has smaller effects as far as being hard for people to transition to. Whereas if we were to try to eradicate cars, that has become such a necessary part of everyday life for people, that I think the two items are incomparable in that kind of a way.
Thank you.
I'm going to go back to the question of feasibility here, and you made the statement that you feel like consumer demand will increase for these natural products, and that that will kind of happen by itself. Now, given the fact that, say, low-income families, which maybe make up a large number of our population, are not able to afford these kind of products, organic products, or ones produced by natural farming methods, and there is not sufficient consumer demand for these products, would you advocate government intervention here to move us toward natural and traditional farming methods?
Yeah, I didn't look into that as fully as I wanted to. Of course, I've considered it, but I felt like that I just didn't have enough room in my paper to make a case for that. But however, I would say that some form of government intervention would be necessary, even if it's not. I wouldn't advocate for any kind of government mandate, because I don't think forcing people to adopt this form of agriculture is necessarily the best way to change our system. But some sort of government promotion and just government propaganda and promotion for this idea, I think would definitely speed the case along. But no, I would not advocate for a kind of government mandate.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, that's all the time we have for questions. I want to thank our judges and also thank Ashley. What a wonderful job. Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you all so much.
Nicely done, Ashley.
Thank you.
Yay.